Okay, we'll start. People will join in directly. I'll start with the introduction. So, as I said, these episodes are mainly for our YouTube sessions. I welcome everyone to our conservation episodes, Zooming Conservation, the podcast series that zooms into the heart of wildlife conservation. I'm your host Apurva, and today marks our second episode in our exciting 100-part journey. Second Saturday of May is celebrated as World's Migratory Birds Day. In our ongoing exploration of conservation issues, we are turning our attention to a group of avian wonders, migratory birds. These feathered travelers captivate us with their epic migrations spanning across the continents, showcasing the marvels of nature's resilience and adaptability. Joining us today is a remarkable individual, Ashwin Vishwanathan, whose journey from mechanical engineer to ecologist embodies the spirit of interdisciplinary passion for nature. A seasoned birdwatcher, Ashwin's early research in plant biology ignited a deep-seated curiosity for the natural world. Over time, he became involved with the power of public participation in scientific ventures. Now a vital member of bird monitoring team at Nature Conservation Foundation, Ashwin and his colleagues advocate for the systematic monitoring of birds population, leveraging the invaluable contribution of citizen scientists to generate actionable knowledge for conservation. In this episode, we'll unravel the mysteries of migratory birds, exploring the extraordinary journey, the challenges they face, and the vital role they play in maintaining the ecological balance across the continents. So, without any further delay, let's dive into the captivating world of migratory birds with our guest Ashwin on Zooming Conservation. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. You can see my video, right? Can see the presentation?
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah. So thanks, Apurva. It's a real pleasure to be here and speak on this occasion of Migratory Bird Day. Today is also another big day, which is the Endemic Bird Day in the south. And the reason for that is that while there is amazing migration, birds moving through northern India and many parts of the world, many of the migrants have already moved out of southern India. And I live in the south in Bangalore, and you'll see why that's important. So, what we have here now are a lot of endemic birds, a lot of resident birds that we can celebrate at this time. But during the winter, we get to enjoy the wonders of migration. So, what is migration? Migration is just regular seasonal movement. So in India, it's largely movement from colder areas in the north, let's say the Himalayas or beyond the Himalayas, and birds that in the winter, when it becomes too cold there, they come down to India where there's a lot of food. It's a much nicer place to be when it's close to 0 degrees up in more northern areas. And it's also a bit of a funnel, the country. So there are large numbers of birds that come in from many nearby areas, from Russia and China and Central Asia, and birds, like millions and millions of birds from all these areas, come down to the country. So it's usually from breeding to non-breeding areas. So in the summer, birds tend to breed. They tend to make their nests, they lay eggs, the chicks come out, and in the non-breeding season, they tend to migrate and come to more southern latitudes. I'll also explain other kinds of migration later, but this is a typical migration that we know of. So an example of a migratory bird in India. So this is an Indian blue robin, a really beautiful small bird that some of you may have seen. But like you can see from the map over here, this is a map from State of India's Birds, which was a report published about the status of India's birds by many organizations. You can look at the State of India's Birds website to see this map and other information about birds. You see that they breed in this bird during the summer, which is orange color, is in the Himalayas mostly. And in the winter, it's down in the south, in the Western Ghats, in hills of South India. So you can see that there's this movement every year, all the way from the Himalayas down to southern India. And this is a regular seasonal movement. Some of them, you can see these yellow dots. Those are in spring and autumn. That season we are in now is just before summer. It's spring. So this is a season where the birds are still moving back. So even yesterday there was news of one Indian blue robin from Bangalore, where it from where it should go back. And everybody was excited. So late in the season, there's still an Indian blue robin. People in the Himalayas said that they've already started coming there. So there is this conversation that starts between people who live in one part of the bird's range and people in the other part. So when does this migration happen? So when does this breeding to non-breeding area movement happen? So it's something we discussed here. Typically, birds go back in April and May to the breeding areas, and sometime in September, October, they tend to go to their wintering areas. Most of this migration, amazingly, happens in the night. It's when we are sleeping, there are millions of birds migrating in the night sky, and we can't see it. In some places where there are very small areas for migration, in places in Europe and some other known parts of the world, you can actually sit on your balcony in the night, in the middle of the night, and if you look up at the moon or look up at the clouds, you can actually see birds moving across, and you can hear them calling. So you can actually make your eBird checklist or make checklists just in the night by watching the moon and seeing thousands of birds pass the moon. Don't have that kind of a place where you can see it here in India. They tend to fly much higher and in much not in concentrated areas. But that's something for all of us to find out when thousands and millions of people in the country start looking up at the night sky. We can find out when and where birds are migrating. They
So
also
I
prefer
have one
certain.
question.
Sorry. Yeah.
I have one question over here.
Yes.
So birds have vision at night. Like all birds have vision at night.
No. So they can't see very well at night. They often
Okay.
migrate using other faculties that they have. They orient according to the to magnetic poles. They also have magnetic some ability to detect magnetic direction in their eyes. They also are able to use moonlight or starlight or whatever ambient light there is to orient themselves a little better. So yeah, they can't see very well in the night, but yet they migrate at night, largely because many of their predators also are not active at night. So when you have so many flying there during the day, many of them will just get eaten up. So it's a safer time to fly as well. And there are, for example, raptors, birds of prey. Birds of prey, they don't have to worry about anything attacking them. They fly during the day, birds of prey. They migrate during the day. Storks migrate during the day. Many large birds migrate during the day. And for raptors, because they have these really large wings and they're very heavy birds, they avoid migrating across the sea. So what you'll see for raptors, birds of prey, is that they prefer to take a long route along land rather than to cross. Because when they cross the sea, it becomes very dangerous for them to cross such wide areas without any food. I'll give you an example. So this is an example of a bird called European buzzard. Or was it? Yeah, I think, or lesser spotted eagle maybe, migrating from Europe to Africa. And the migratory routes that you see with the red lines from their summer breeding areas to their wintering areas, you see that they are all going where there is land. They're crossing, even if there's a tiny part of land for them to cross over, they cross over that. And because of that, there are actually, if you stand at the correct point where there is a land crossing, like you see this this Gibraltar over here in southern Spain and connecting to Africa. That area, if you stand and look up in the sky, look up at raptors migrating in March and April, you can see thousands and thousands of birds of prey from a single point. You can see them flying. There are many such places around the world. There are some very nice raptor migration points even in India, in the Himalaya, where you can see many hundreds of raptors flying from single points. So huge numbers pass through small areas in such cases. So this can also happen with other birds. As I said, in India, migration is not very concentrated, but there are certain islands, certain places where even these smaller birds called or passerines pass through in very, very large numbers. Often after, let's say, there are a few days of rain when they're not able to fly in the night, and suddenly all the birds that are waiting to migrate go on a single day and they go along a single area. On such days, you can see these most remarkable events like this website here. I mean, this article is called "The River of Wobblers: The Greatest Birding Day of My Life." And this is something that I suggest you all Google and take a look at this article, where a team of people, they have, I think it's somewhere in Canada and Quebec, they have seen 50, 100,000 birds in a single morning flying all around them. There are times when they're passing by their face. And this is 30, 40 species of 10,000 species of one I mean, 10,000 individuals of one warbler, another 20,000 individuals for another warbler species, and 100,000 individuals bird. So you see 500,000 birds in a single morning. Imagine what that spectacle would have been like. And check this out. There's also an eBird checklist that was made on that day, so you can see the exact numbers of everything. So migration is a remarkable phenomenon. So there are close to 2,000 migratory species in the world. In India, there are many hundred species of migrants, and based on exactly which bird you choose to include, these numbers vary a little bit. This is a barn swallow, a very common migrant in India. And if any of you think about whether you've seen barn swallow or not, they come in big numbers during winter, and they mostly spend the winter at our wetlands. But what do they do in summer? They actually go and go to the Himalayas, they go to Europe, and they nest in people's houses. So they become very close to people. Sometimes, if you go to the Himalayas, you'll even find them in shops where people are, where there's a lot of business going on, and in a corner you'll have a barn swallow feeding its family. So people tend to get very close to them, and then what happens is then they start looking forward to their return, because the chicks grow up and then they leave for the winter, and then everybody says, when are the barn swallows going to come back? And when they come back, they say that yes, now it is spring or now it is summer. So migratory birds are an indication of season also. This is a very, very nice example of how people love migration from Valparai, a place in Tamil Nadu, where there's a group of young birders. And every year they celebrate the arrival of the first grey wagtail. Grey wagtail is another bird that comes from the Himalayas and Europe. And the first grey wagtail is celebrated by people in the community there. And they have a small party to say that they saw their first grey wagtail of the season. It's usually in end of August. So now they've all gone. End of August is when they start looking forward. Is today going to be the day the first grey wagtail comes? So you can imagine, tells you something about it's the start of winter. This is pied cuckoo. Pied cuckoo, again, very iconic in the country. It's thought to tell us about the arrival of the monsoon, the rainy season. When they start showing up and they start singing, they start making their calls. You can see what their sound is like on Merlin, the app, and you can see whether you have heard that sound at any point. So this is pied cuckoo, harbinger of the monsoon. This is a cartoon. This is a bird. This is an Arctic skua. It's a bird that breeds in the Arctic, very, very far north. And it's an example of how these skuas just connect the world. This is a bird that spends its summer and lays its eggs in the Arctic. In the non-breeding season, they're in the Indian Ocean and they go all the way close to the Antarctic almost. And through the year, because they go to every ocean of the world, to every continent of the world, they're actually connecting the entire world. So while all of us are in our small areas, we live where we live, we don't go, we cannot travel so much. Arctic skuas as a species, they're just going across the entire world and coming back. A single individual almost is covering most of the world and coming back. So you see that what they manage to do is at every point of time, they are in summer. And how is that? Because in the Arctic, they're in the summer. What happens if you go in the northern hemisphere winter to the Antarctic? You actually are going to the southern hemisphere summer. So they're always in summer. They go from summer to summer. This is also what Arctic tern does. They never face a winter. Many migrants that come to India still face a winter. But some of these birds that go from the Arctic to the Antarctic don't know what winter is like. How do birds migrate? So this is, I briefly answered this a little earlier. But there are two things they do. One is they need to navigate broad areas. How does a bird go from the Arctic to the Antarctic? They need to broadly know the direction in which they're flying. But at the same time, they also need to know the exact place they're going to. So they need to both navigate and they need to orient themselves. Like I have a bird called Blythe's warbler that comes to my house every year. Every year they come on November 8th or November 9th. And this has been happening for many years. It's a small brown bird that comes all the way from Russia, likely, those birds. They come to two bushes in my house and they do this chuck chuck sound. And they come on almost the same date. So they don't just need to find their way to Bangalore, they need to find their way to that bush in my house in Bangalore. So you can imagine how sophisticated their direction ability to find their way is. So they can perceive magnetic fields. There's some evidence that they can do it through the upper layers of their bill. Eyes also might be involved in this, in having getting magnetic cues. They also orient themselves to the sun, to stars, and there's some understanding that they might also be able to smell their way to certain areas, like dogs are able to do, for example. One thing birds do before migration, you see in this photo, is that before they travel, they tend to put on a lot of fat. So they eat a lot before they migrate. So they eat. They develop these layers of fat so that for days and days they can migrate non-stop. So now I'll show you some examples of migration action. So we know that birds need to fatten up a lot before migration. But when they migrate, what does it look like? From where to where are they going? This is an example. So these maps, to show many of these maps, these are generated by the public. These are generated by bird watchers. And yeah, you're able to see this, right?
Yes, yes, I'm
Yeah.
able to see that.
Okay. So I wanted to take a second to look at this. Just look at what's happening. You have all of these points actually in the temperate world. Then they go through India. They're in Africa. Now they're going back to Europe, temperate Asia, back down through India, down into Africa, right? So what
Yeah.
is happening here is actually birds are not being tracked. But what is happening is bird watchers everywhere in the world are reporting this bird whenever they see it. So through that, you get this idea of migration, where at every point, bird watchers are reporting a snapshot of what they see. So let's say I see a migrant today. I make a checklist with that migrant. So that will be one point over here. But now getting into June and July, none of my checklists will have that migrant, but people are going to have it in Europe. So through that, you get this illusion of migration. But this is one of the most powerful ways for us as a community to learn about migration. Because how many birds can be tagged? That's really important. Satellite tracking birds, figuring out where individuals go, but you cannot do it to a million birds. So you cannot touch large areas. So this is a really nice way for us to do this ourselves. You don't need professional scientists to be doing it. Report birds so that we can understand migration. So I'll explain this graph a little more. I mean, this map a little more. The bird that you're seeing in the picture is common cuckoo. Common cuckoo is the quintessential cuckoo, as they say. It's the very famous cuckoo that does cuckoo. It's not a quail, not the one that does coo, not that one. This is a cuckoo, and this bird migrates through India. It also breeds in the Himalayas and parts of central India, but it migrates through South India and goes all the way to Africa. It crosses the Arabian Sea and goes to Africa. And you can see this graph below. This graph at one point it goes up. That is when they're vocal. That is when they're singing. They're doing cuckoo. And that is why they are the cuckoo in cuckoo clocks. If any of you have seen a cuckoo clock, because they come in the summer and then they start making this really amazing sound. So let's look at other examples of migration. Migration within the subcontinent. What is the subcontinent? It is India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan. This entire region is thought to be the subcontinent. And there are many birds that migrate only within this region. One of the most important birds for us in India that does this is the pitta, Indian pitta, a remarkably beautiful bird, breeds in central and north India. So now it's in the south in winter. So May, June, July, August, and then it comes back south and Sri Lanka. And then it goes up to central India and North India to breed. This is an example of migration within the subcontinent. Next, the sort of migration we already spoke about, breeding in the north and migrating south for the winter. This is typical migration. And this is a bird I mentioned earlier called the blithe. Remember, one or two of these birds come to my house. They're going in the summer. They're going
Yes, yes.
so far north for the summer, or to Finland, Western Russia, and then they fill up the entire country, the subcontinent during winter. So what this means is that we talk about endemic birds, right? Birds that are very important to the country and that are there within the country at all times. There are some migrants like Blythe-Reed warbler that actually go breed somewhere else, but in the winter, we are custodians of that bird. That the entire population of the species, of millions and millions of birds, is completely within the Indian subcontinent. So when we think about conservation of certain birds, we think about endemics. Actually, birds like this should have some prominence because there is nobody else who can protect this bird during winter. So we have an important role to play for species like Blythe-Reed warbler. Breeding in the south and migrating north for summer. So this is something that I haven't discussed yet. And these are birds that breed. I mean, typically birds breed in the summer and they go in the non-breeding season, they fly south. What this bird does is it breeds in the winter in India and it flies north during the non-breeding season to Mongolia for the summer. So it comes down to Assam, Uttarakhand, all these areas. It makes its nest, it breeds, and then in the non-breeding season in the summer, it goes to Mongolia. So you'll find very few examples like this. This is a Pallas fish eagle, very, very interesting, large fish eagle that you can see in some parts of northern India. Passage migration into Africa. Common cuckoo also does this that we showed, but there is a much better example of this. Amur falcon. I think many of you would have heard of Amur falcon. Also for the successful conservation story in the Northeast, where everybody has grown to really love the bird and its hunting has reduced a lot. So they come in tens of thousands to Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram. They fly through the country, they go to South Africa. The same birds then fly through and go to Northeast China and Mongolia. So you see how amazing this is. They're flying across the Arabian Sea and they're still at the moment going back. And now in Assam, Arunachal Pradesh, a few birds are being seen on their way back to China. Next one. This is a bird called the European roller. This is another passage migrant through India. Take a second to look at this map and notice what is happening in India. It's coming in big numbers to the western part of the country and then crossing the sea and going to Africa, East and South Africa. On the way back, it doesn't pass through the country as much. Only on the way down.
Why is that?
That's a good question. I'm glad you asked. What is the important thing in India post in September, October, these seasons? These are the months after our monsoon is finished. So India is one of few countries to have a monsoon during this period. So immediately after that, everything is really lush and there's a lot of food and life around. So this is a really good time for birds to pass through the country because the monsoon is just finished. Insect activity is very high. So they get a lot of food on their way down. On the way back in April and May, passing through India is a very bad idea. As we all know, it's very hot. The entire country is just, the sun is blazing down. There's barely any food available and there's been no rain for quite a while. So that's why you'll find many birds coming through in autumn, but not in spring.
But then it might be the same case in African continents also. The heat wave is there also. So does it affect them?
Yes. So what they tend to do is they tend to go back much faster on the way back. So on the way down, they spend a lot of time in between feeding and going. On the way back, they tend to just take a few days instead of 1 month. They put in that effort to just go full speed back. stopping anywhere on the way will mean very little reward for them. Yeah, that's true. So there are few special areas where they may stop on the way back, but that's about it. This is westward migration into Africa. Uh, a similar example, but this is not a bird that is coming from Europe and temperate parts of Asia. This is a bird that comes to India to in the summer to breed. So you see, it's crossing the Arabian Sea and coming to northern India and other parts of the country. In the south, there is a resident population of pied cuckoo. So this is thought to be migration that coincides with the monsoon. Now it's coming here, it's coming into the country, then going back to Africa. Here's a really interesting example. So far, we have only looked at birds going into Africa. We have looked at birds coming south into the country from Europe. But there are also birds that are going from India into Southeast Asia and Australia. And an example of that is white-throated needletail. And this is an example that I sometimes speak about because during COVID, Australia and such areas had to be very careful for many reasons because they are an isolated island. There are many animals there that and many let's say and generally people, if any disease or anything goes in, they need to be really careful. While humans cannot go, which is why human movement was very strictly restricted. But during this entire time, this 1 year when nobody could go into Australia from, let's say, India, if we wanted to go, white-throated needletail, the entire population from the Himalayas was going to the eastern coast of Australia and coming back. So you see, there are birds always crossing these barriers where it's dangerous for humans to go, but it's completely fine for birds to do it. See, this is an interesting kind of migration from the Himalayas to Australia. Opposite migration from the south to the north. This is something we haven't spoken of. There are birds that breed not just in the Arctic, but there are ones that breed in the Antarctic as well, or close to the Antarctic. This is a Wilson storm petrel. And watch out for what is happening now in December, January, which is the summer in the Antarctic. It breeds in the Antarctic in their summer, and for their winter, it comes down to our coastline and to the tropical coastline. So it actually is a visitor during summer for us, not in winter. Our summer, their winter, they come along. So think about this a little bit. Their winter is our summer. So they're a summer visitor for us. Actually, in the monsoon, if you go out in a boat, in a ship, if you go from the west coast of India, you can see hundreds of this bird, Wilson's storm petrel. But in winter, there will be none because they're down near Antarctic breeding. There are many pelagic trips that happen off the Indian coast. And if you ever hear of any, I strongly recommend that you go out into the sea and see what it's like. There's so much life, even out in the sea. These are birds that will never come onto the land. In fact, this one has an interesting behavior, this Wilson's storm petrel. It tends to run on the water a bit. It comes, stops, it hops on the water, and it feeds that way. You can also use citizen science data like this, public data from bird watchers, to compare migratory routes. So these are two common species in the country, brown shrike and Isabelline shrike. So you can see that their breeding areas, Isabelline shrike breeds slightly westwards of brown shrike is slightly east, and their migratory routes also follow similar pathways, where Isabelline shrike stays a little bit on the west in Middle East, Africa, and Western and Northern India, and brown shrike is in Southern, Eastern India, and in Southeast Asia in winter. So you see these closely related species follow parallel migratory paths like this and on their way back. These are evolutionary adaptations. You don't want every species to be in the same place. Then there'll be much more competition for resources. So these are closely related birds that follow different pathways. You can also use this kind of public data to look at new migrants. And this is actually a really important phenomenon in where everything you see that there is a certain bird that goes from one place to another place every year. But this need not be the same. This can change. This can change mostly based on changing climate or other things that we don't understand. So when a migratory route of a bird changes, it's something for us to think about. Why has this change happened? Is it because of some change in climate? Is it because rainfall patterns have changed? Is it because temperatures have changed? Now that it's becoming so hot in India, does it mean that birds are going to go back a little earlier? Does it mean they're not going to come to some of the hottest places in the country? There are many impacts that are there on birds that can also teach us about ourselves and what climate impacts are happening. So here I'll give you an example of this bird called yellow-browed warbler. So yellow-browed warbler once upon a time used to uh, breed in Northeast Asia, and it used to winter mostly in Northeast India and Southeast Asia. But what people have been observing over the last maybe 20 years is that now there is a different migratory route. There are large numbers of birds also going into Europe. So there are two migratory routes, one coming to Southeast Asia and Northeast India, one going into Europe. Can you see both the routes here? There are two different routes.
Yes, yes, I can.
Yeah. So one from there, and then they're going westwards, they're also going southwards. So there are two different routes, and this western route through Europe appears to be a relatively new route. What does this mean for the bird? And what does this mean for a general understanding of how the world is adapting to change? There's a lot that this can teach us. Some other interesting phenomena. This is a bird called the Arctic warbler. Another bird that previously was there in Northeast Asia and went down to Southeast Asia, but slowly it's been expanding its breeding range further and further and further westwards. Now it breeds all the way to Finland and Norway and these areas. But the birds that breed so many thousands of kilometers westwards are still going in winter to Southeast Asia. Just imagine, they've shifted their breeding range, but they're traveling so many more kilometers and going eastwards and then southwards rather than cutting across India, for example, which might make it easier for them. So there is some kind of memory, evolutionary memory for these birds when they migrate. And just an interesting example that the migratory route remains the same even if the bird has to migrate thousands of kilometers more. This is another similar example of the northern wheatear, but in the opposite direction. It used to breed in Europe, winter in Africa. Now it breeds all the way into East Asia and Alaska, and yet they still all winter in Africa. So take a look at all of this later. This is on YouTube. So stare at these maps a little more later, and I think there's a lot that you can get from these maps later. So this is just to show what is happening. Instead of going so close, you see this Africa, the birds that breed near Alaska, if they just go a few thousand kilometers, they've reached their African winter grounds. But instead, what do? They go all the way across Asia and they still go to Africa. So it follow a very, very long route. Okay. And there's also some new learning. We used to think that this species, black-capped kingfisher, was a resident bird. But thanks to public data and other literature, it looks like the entire population in India are winter visitors. They are migratory. Black-capped kingfisher, that's such a common bird in Sundarbans and Bhitarkanika, some of these mangrove areas, is completely a winter visitor to the country. And mangrove habitats are so important. They go to East Asia in summer. Imagine a kingfisher being a long-distance migrant. These migration maps, you can view them on the Bird Count India website. If you'd like to view them, there are many, many more maps there, and those are updated regularly. If any of you are into coding, if you want to produce such maps yourself, if you want to, take the data and do whatever you want, all the data is downloadable, it's public. The code that was used to make this is there in this. You look at the link below at this GitHub link. And the code is also available for you to take and do whatever you feel like with it. Now I'll briefly get to scientific means that are used to study migratory birds. So here we have satellite tags. This is a bird called a curlew, and this is how a satellite tag is attached to it. And using that, you can find out exact migration routes for a single species and a single individual. If you tag multiple individuals like this, you can find out exact routes they're taking. And why is that important? This is very important in addition to what we saw previously, because you know exact sites that are important for them. And a lot of conservation we do has to be at the site level. So that's really important. It also tells us a lot about the species. What kind of habitats does it need while moving through? What are the exact times that it passes through? There's a lot of important learning through satellite tracking. So this is an example of a bird called Oriental Pratt Cole, which thanks to satellite tags, we actually found out that birds from India are going to Australia, which was a shocking learning for us about 6, 7 years back. What happened was some birds were tagged in Australia, Oriental Pratt and Cole, and which we didn't know about in India. And once one of their birds had had disappeared, and they'd gone really far from Australia, and they found out through the satellite tags that it had actually reached India, but nobody in India knew this yet. So they called up some bird watchers in India, got some numbers, and said, "Can you go and find this bird? It appears it's come here, but that seems very surprising. Why would it come to India from Australia?" And this was in a reservoir in central Karnataka. It was hot in April, May, and there was a birdwatcher called Subbu Subramania and some others. They went to these islands, hired some boats in the scorching heat, went and actually found the bird that had this tag on it. And that's when, and they took photos of it, and it was amazing that a bird that had been tagged in Australia was now rediscovered over here. And then they found that there are thousands of birds from India that go to Australia and back, Oriental Pratt Coles. They come to these hot islands in across the country, reservoirs, these small grassy areas to breed in. Non-breeding season, they wander all the way into Southeast Asia and then Australia. So these are multiple birds that were tagged. You can see some of the migratory routes over here. These are some other things to understand migration, that is to attach flags, rings and flags. So these are shorebirds, and there are many organizations in India also that attach flags to birds. And this is useful because when photographers take photos of them, you can actually read the number of the tag, and you can trace the tag back to where it came from. So you take this and then you can send it, put it on social media, or find out who are the people who are putting flags, and they'll tell you, yes, so this bird has come from some other part of the country. Skimmer, the bird at the bottom, uh, there's been so much learning through these flags. There are birds that have been tagged in Chambal, the river, that have gone to Jamnagar in Gujarat, that have gone to Odisha, that have gone to Kakinada and Andhra Pradesh, and have gone to Bangladesh. These are birds that are all from the same area, are migrating to different corners of their wintering range. In winter, it goes to coastal areas, typically Indian skimmer. In the summer, they're in rivers completely, inland. Another way you can study birds is radar. This is something we don't have in India yet, but you can track migration through radar. This happens regularly in US, and you can see that on the night of September 1st, 2021, where I got this image from. That night there were 290 million birds predicted to migrate across the country. September is during the migratory season. We don't have this yet in India, but hopefully in the future something like this will be possible, where we can actually find out what is going on up in our skies. So I don't have much longer. I'm just going to talk about one concept. It's a final slide. And I'm going to talk to you about one problem that arises from climate change to migratory birds. And this is called a trophic mismatch. So I'll take you through a small visualization of what I mean. So this is a bird called a red knot. Let's say that it typically migrates, it leaves its wintering areas in, let's say, February, March, April. Let's say March, April, typically. It flies all the way to the evolutionarily has adapted to fly at such a time that when it goes there, it builds its nest, lays eggs, and the chicks hatch. There is peak insect availability. That's the maximum availability of insects. So many of you would have observed this phenomenon that suddenly when the rains come in many parts of the country, suddenly there are insects everywhere for a while. And that is a peak insect availability. Then after that, if it rains continuously for a bit, insects reduce again. There's a similar thing that happens with ice melt. So in places like the Arctic where birds breed, when the ice melts in March or April, immediately, like a few days after that, all of the insects come out, because that's an indication that there is it's time to come out. Then, as you go 1 month into the period after the ice melts, availability reduces because the insects have short life cycles. They live for a small period and then they die. But what birds have evolutionarily adapted to do is that they've adapted to time their arrival in the Arctic and the arrival of the chicks in the Arctic exactly with when the most insects are available. So then they come out, they eat the maximum number of insects, they grow up to be really nice, healthy individuals, and then they're ready to migrate back to their wintering areas, let's say in India, in
हाँ,
autumn.
वो अभी बजट के ऊपर थोड़ा डिस्कशन करना है। हेमंत टीम्स में इनवाइट भेज रहा है, ये तो
Yeah.
फिर हम
So what happens in summer? In summer, what happens is that actually this entire period shifts a little bit. The ice starts melting about 1 or 2 months earlier. So what happens then is these birds that have flown thousands of kilometers, they go back at the same time. But what has happened? The ice has already melted, the insects have already come out. And then when the chicks come out, insects have already started reducing. So this is what is called a trophic mismatch. And this is a documented reason for much lower survival in many Arctic breeding birds. And what happens then? These chicks grow up to be less strong individuals that have a much higher chance of not surviving their long migration after that. So that's it. This hopefully is tells you something about the beauty of migration and also about how migration is an adaptation that is so sensitive to changes in the environment like climate change. To find out more about birds and to find out more about what is happening in the birding world, I suggest you look at the Bird Alliance website, which is a which is an aggregation of all information that you'd like about birds, and also this newsletter called the Flock. That will bring information about birds in nature straight to you. So if there's any new, anything nice about migration, any event, anything that you can participate in, you're likely to hear about it over here. So take a look at this, subscribe to the newsletter, and that's all from me. I'll take some questions. I hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you so much for very nice presentation. So there was one question from Naeem Akhtar. He is
Okay.
asking, aquatic birds are largely migratory in nature, but there are very few aquatic species. Those were studied to access nature and extent of migration as compared to other species, such as raptors. Can you explain if I'm not wrong?
Can I see the question also? Maybe I'll just take a look at
You
it
can see it on the chat. In the
on
chat
the
section,
chat.
you can.
Ah.
Yeah.
I don't see the message. Would you be able to copy and paste it in chat?
Yeah, I'm doing that only.
Yeah.
Now is it visible?
Now I see them all. Yeah, from Naeem Akhtar. Aquatic birds are largely migratory in nature. I think yes, there are fewer aquatic birds that are being studied, but that's generally because it's much more difficult to catch birds that are in the water. I think maybe you're talking about seabirds or I'm not sure which birds. But pelagic birds, the ones in the sea, they can easily be caught and tags attached to them in their nesting islands. So this is often done. So these birds like Wilson's storm petrel and many of these other seabirds are actually very well studied. Their migration is maybe better understood than some of our common raptors, like even Indian spotted eagle in the country.
Okay. I have some questions. The tag
Yeah.
that we use in thoughts. So, is there any specific format that for which we can refer it back and understand?
Yes. So there are many kinds of tags that I used, but I don't think I'm the best person to tell you best tag to use because I haven't done any satellite tracking myself. But I'd
No, not
suggest
about
that
the setting,
yeah.
but the rings that we attach,
Sorry.
the rings that we attach in the boards.
Huh. Okay. Rings that you
Do that
attach.
have also
So
format?
the
Yeah,
rings that you attach, one important thing for that is that they need to be coded correctly. For
yeah,
example, if you want to be able to identify that bird later from photographs, uh, or you want to identify exactly which individual that was, there has to be a color code or a code on the ring that is embedded into the ring that tells you that yes, this is the individual that was captured earlier. And that is a really important ability to be able to identify the individual in any studies of survival or demography to find out what is happening to a population. Are certain individuals surviving? How many years are they surviving? So for that, you need to be able to identify individuals. In some studies, they're not interested in identifying individuals. They just want to know which ones have been tagged, which ones have not been tagged. In such cases, you just need any steel ring or any a single color ring is also okay. Yeah.
So, and uh, the where you were talking about two birds that regularly visit to your place
Yeah.
at same time. So, is that same memory passed on to the chicks also? So, there is some specific memory that is there in birds, the same time, same place. So, is that same memory passed on to the chicks?
Yeah. So migration, the tendency to migrate is passed on to the chicks, but the chicks may not come to the same bush. So they may go to a completely different area. So actually, what happens in the first year of migration, birds tend to explore. I mean, they tend to experience that for the first time. So you'll find that a lot of birds that have landed up in random places, that have been blown away by wind, that have lost their way, those will often be young birds that are experiencing migration for the first time. So it's something that also needs to be learned, and they find their own place to go and spend the winter in. Yeah.
So, it is not compulsory or necessary for chicks also to visit the same place.
No, it's not compulsory. But likely what will happen is that, let's say this bird lives its life, the one that is there in my garden in winter, after it might live for a few years. And after that, then maybe there'll be a year when no bird comes. But then this is such a common bird that they're going to be all of these territories being taken up. So after that, all it needs is one black-sided warbler to fly over that area and say, okay, is there a bird that's nice habitat? Let me go and try that place. If it goes to that place and there's another bird already there, it'll be chased away. It'll have to go find another place. If it goes there and there's no other bird, then it will take over that new territory after that. But it need not be offspring of the previous bird.
Then how do citizen science projects contribute to our understanding of migratory birds, like the best maps that you have seen? But other than that, like what all has citizen science project have helped you in conservation in building the strategies?
Yeah, so mostly citizen science does two things, I think, two very important things. The first, I would say, the most important thing is it creates a community of people who are both engaged with science and who develop a scientific temper. So it's not just initiatives where data is being collected. It's people who are engaging with that data and then producing some knowledge. You'll see that there'll be social media posts where people say, okay, I looked at this data and this is what I found. There are also in Indian Birds, the journal, the number of publications from birdwatchers has grown tremendously. Birdwatchers now are taking the data, are looking at birds around them, observing patterns, and are publishing so much amazing science. So that is one thing that citizen science initiatives lead to a community that is much more scientifically tuned in. The second thing is that it allows the ability to build huge data sets that otherwise not possible. How many scientists can we have in the country? 500,000? But imagine the power of the public. When everybody is observing birds like this, collecting that data, you can have data sets that can then lead to uh, reports like the State of India's birds, where you have millions of observations that have been analyzed to help us prioritize which birds to conserve in the country. And I think that is a really nice way for public participation to feed into conservation. And then these are now recommendations made to the government, made to other bodies that are looking for this kind of recommendation, like which birds should we conserve? Should we look at Indian Kosa or should we look at Blythe-Reed Warbler? And State of India's bird says that yes, Indian Kosa is declining, and the habitat that it's there in, which are these grasslands, is a very important habitat because there are few birds that are declining in that habitat. So this is through citizen science entirely. So this gives some kind of direction for us to apply conservation.
And about the climate change that you mentioned, is there any visible change that you see currently in any migratory pattern? because of climate change, because of the heat wave in India? Is there any extraordinary change in the
So I
climate
have some
patterns?
things that I have noticed, but those are anecdotes in that it's my observations. But I would say that in terms of like broad patterns where the data itself is telling something, I would say there are examples like let's say um, shorebird arrival, something we spoke about, all of these Arctic birds. The data says that they're actually going back at the same time, but unfortunately that time is uh, we also have other examples of birds are changing their are not able to nest as successfully. So they're nesting at a particular time. Hornbills in Northeast India were an example. Like for the last in a year or two back, there was an example of many hornbills having failed nests. And the understanding was this is because of some changing patterns in climate, which either meant there was less food, maybe not so many fruits available, not so many insects available. There's so many things that need to happen at the same time. So there are many such events that are there. There are some things that are well researched. There are many things that we observe as bird watchers. So I might say that okay, this year that it hasn't rained so much now for the last 1 or 2 months. Only now it started raining in Bangalore. There are many migratory birds that remained. They didn't leave. And perhaps if there were slightly earlier rains, maybe they'd have left a little earlier. So there are many thoughts that way, anecdotes, but actually, I think it's important that we depend on studies or research to decide what has actually changed with climate change. Yeah.
I was about to come on the changed raining patterns because it rains sometimes off season. So does it affect the birds like who are there and they have
Yes,
came in winter? If there are rains in November, does it affect the bird?
yes. It these all of these unseasonal rains can have big impacts on birds. I think how exactly it's going to impact is going to depend from species to species. But
But
yes, rains can have a very big impact.
then I have one question about flamingos. So flamingos are migratory, but now you
Which
can
one?
see some flamingos that flamingos. Are you? Am I audible?
Flamingos. Okay, yeah. Huh.
Yeah. So they are basically migratory, but in Mumbai at some sites, now you can see flamingos like all across the year. So there the behavioral change in them that has stopped them from traveling. What is the reason? What might be the reason?
Right. So some of these birds, like flamingos, and there are actually other examples like this. They realize over time that maybe they don't need to move.
Okay.
You'll find flamingos great, especially greater flamingos in Mumbai lesser as well. But
Yeah.
greater flamingos, you'll find them being there year round, even in South India. They're there in Pulicat year round, they're there in Point Calumet year round, and they weren't there in the past. It's not that these birds are breeding there yet, but many of them are not moving back at all, at least in certain years. So they don't always. It doesn't mean that a bird that's there in the summer is going to be breeding. I don't know whether the flamingos in Mumbai are breeding. They're not, right?
They're not.
They're not breeding.
But
They're just spending the non-breeding
they're
season
just
over there.
yeah, they're just
So this
there
can be
yearly.
because maybe there's a lot of food available. Then it's not ideal conditions for nesting, but there is so much food that they're not going back. It can also be that they don't want to put in that effort to fly back because it's too hot or there are other conditions that are not favorable. So yeah,
I was
but yeah,
about to
there are
say
many
the
such
same
changes
thing.
that we see.
So is there any like this specific species that you mentioned that only comes to India in winters and no other place? Like, are there any active conservation strategies in place to conserve such species? Like, not that
There are
specific,
for
otherwise,
yes, there are for many waterfowl. So waterfowl monitoring has been a big thing in India for a long time. There's been AWC, there have been other initiatives to monitor waterfowl, and waterfowl conservation has also been a bit of a priority in many parts of India for a long time. Not just ducks, but also other birds that are associated with water. So there have been wetlands that have been protected. There have been sanctuaries that have been declared. There are certain areas where there have been conversations with people about hunting and other activities that can impact birds. So I think migratory birds, especially waterfowl like ducks, have received some attention in the past in the country. We have one very iconic migratory bird that disappeared, which is Siberian crane. Hopefully, that won't happen with any other
Yeah.
species for us. Let's see.
So, what was the reason of the disappearance? Siberian.
Siberian crane mostly hunting along its migratory route, not in India. So in India, they still had good habitat in Bharatpur, but they used to be hunted in the mountains when they were migrating. So most of the population got hunted out.
So, currently, which is the like key species that are hunted, like or face any other problems? Migratory birds.
Some very threatened species, is it? So we have some migrants that are quite rare. For example, sociable lapwing. Sociable lapwing is again quite a threatened species, and it comes to parts of Gujarat and Rajasthan in some numbers. But it's migratory, and important that we look out for it over here as well as in the breeding areas. There's also yellow-eyed pigeon, a species that had declined to very, very small numbers, a migratory bird. But now, luckily, we have a few thousands coming to Jodh, Rajasthan. So that's a good story now. A bird that had become very, very few is still now migrating to good numbers, in good numbers to some part of India, but it's still a species that requires attention.
Then bird watching is an like increasing hobby in current young generation.
Yeah.
So, what role does oversight play in life? Play to contribute the local communities through activities like bird watching tourism. It has positive and negative effects,
Yeah, yeah.
but like, do you feel there are many negative effects of bird watching tourism?
Oh, I would say that the positive effects greatly outweigh the negative effects because bird watching is primarily about showing people or introducing people to the beauty of birds, and are a conduit into nature, as people say. If I show somebody in my family some birds, if I get them excited, or some random people in the city, I show them something through my binoculars and show them something blue or red or yellow, and it tells them that nature has something beautiful to offer to them. That then percolates, and those people start caring about the natural world. And really, our future completely rests in the hands of the public. If people don't care about nature, then we are going to go down more and more landslides and floods and poorly planned, activities and cities. And we really, really, I think, need people to start enjoying nature and valuing it. And there are other advantages as well. And you'd have seen many articles that actually it's really good for the mind. It's really good for mental health. When people start getting some joy in nature, it makes their lives better.
Yeah.
And I think generally, I feel like there's a moral responsibility for me to introduce people to birds. Bird tourism is an amazing way for that. And I think just the positive impacts of bird tourism, introducing people to birds, is just so important that a few minor impacts here and there are something that can always be ironed out. Yeah.
Okay. So, looking ahead, what are the key priorities for ensuring the long-term survival of migratory birds? Like any like specific things that citizens can help and contribute
Right, right. So I think
in
the
moment of
main public
need.
contribution can be in monitoring. Birds have to be continued to be monitored, whether it's in in the local wetland near them or somewhere far away. Make sure that you're documenting what you're seeing and following these birds throughout. But I think another step that the public and anybody else can do is to look at what the data is telling us and act based on that. There are some important takeaways from State of India's birds, for example, that birds in open areas, grasslands, agricultural areas are in trouble. Now, it's important for us as a community, for the government, for all of us together in the country to find out what is it in our agriculture that is doing this. Because it's so important that we retain birds of prey, for example. If birds of prey are going to start dying out, like harriers, our mice are going to increase a lot, and that's going to be a big problem for farmers. So these are things that we need to address. Is it because of the kind of insecticides that we're using? Do we need to change that? Do we need to be a little careful about the chemicals that are going into our agriculture? There are many directions that we need to start thinking and acting. But all of these are open questions. We don't know. All we know is that birds are declining in grasslands and agriculture. But why? We still need to find out.
So this actually needs thorough research over it to get
Yes,
the
yes,
crux of it.
yes.
Okay, I'm done with my questions. It was very nice having you. And I am not a bird person, absolutely. So this was very interesting information for me. I so I would like to conclude the session now. On behalf of Central Authority, I would like to extend heartfelt thank you to Mr. Ashwin for gracing us with his incredible insights and expertise. Uh, Mr. Ashwin's session on migratory birds was nothing short of enlightenment and captivating information. His passion for conservation and his deep understanding of migratory patterns truly has enriched our knowledge and inspired us to do more preservance of the species. We are immensely grateful to Mr. Ashwin dedicating to share his knowledge with us. His contribution to the series has undoubtedly left a lasting impact. I would once again thank you for coming in and giving this incredible session.
Thank you so
And I
much.
would
And thank wonderful questions as well.
they were genuine questions because I don't have any absolute idea.
No, they were really nice questions, I must say, and I think they really enhanced the entire experience.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all the participants as well for joining in our conservation series.